morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that day. At 26 years old, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years, but the weight of the black bearskin hat still felt foreign on his head. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards who stood motionless for hours. Thomas had always been different from his fellow guards. While they discussed football matches and weekend plans during their breaks, he found himself humming melodies under his breath. Music had been his first love long before he ever considered military service. As a child in Manchester, he would spend hours in his bedroom with an old guitar his grandfather had given him, writing songs and dreaming of stages filled with applauding crowds. His parents had different plans. His father, a factory worker, believed in steady employment and pushed Thomas toward a reliable career. The military seemed like a perfect compromise: honor, stability, and a pension. Thomas convinced himself that music could wait. That duty came first. He passed the rigorous selection process for the Queen's Guard with flying colors, impressing his superiors with his discipline and attention to detail. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, protecting one of the most famous families in the world while his own dreams collected dust in a storage unit back home. His guitar hadn't been touched in months. The regimented schedule left little room for creative pursuits, and the tourist crowd saw him only as a living statue, a curiosity to photograph and prod. On this particular Tuesday morning, the crowd seemed larger than usual. A group of American tourists had positioned themselves directly in front of his post, their guide explaining the history and traditions of the Queen's Guard. Thomas could hear their whispered conversations about whether the guards were real people or elaborate decorations. "I bet they're not even allowed to talk," said a middle-aged woman with a southern accent, adjusting her sun hat. "Oh, they're real all right," replied her husband, a tall man with a camera around his neck. "But they're trained not to react to anything. It's like they're robots." Thomas fought the urge to roll his eyes. If only they knew how much effort it took to remain still while tourists made faces at him, told jokes to try to make him laugh, or occasionally even poked him to see if he would react. The training had been thorough. Remain motionless, eyes forward, no matter what happened around him. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, do you think he knows any songs?" "Guards in movies always know songs." His mother smiled and patted his head. "I don't think real guards sing, sweetie. That's just in cartoons." The comment struck Thomas like lightning. The boy's innocent question awakened something that had been sleeping inside him for months. Music wasn't just something from his past. It was part of who he was, buried beneath layers of military precision and tourist indifference. As the morning progressed, more visitors gathered. A street performer had set up nearby playing violin for coins, and Thomas found himself unconsciously keeping time with the melody. The music stirred memories of late nights spent writing songs, of the dreams he had abandoned for the security of his current position. During his brief break, Thomas retreated to the guardhouse where his fellow guards were discussing their upcoming leave. James, a guard from Liverpool, was planning a weekend trip to see his girlfriend. Marcus, the eldest of their unit, was looking forward to spending time with his grandchildren. "What about you, Mitchell?" James asked. "Any plans for the weekend?" Thomas shrugged. "Nothing special. Maybe catch up on some reading." He couldn't bring himself to mention the guitar lessons he had been secretly considering, or the songbook he had been carrying in his bag for weeks. The other guards were good men, but they wouldn't understand his musical aspirations. To them, he was the quiet one, the reliable soldier who never caused trouble. Back at his post that afternoon, the crowd had grown even larger. Tour buses had deposited fresh waves of visitors, all eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Thomas took his position and assumed the familiar stance, shoulders back, chin up, eyes focused on the distance. The afternoon sun was particularly warm, and sweat began to form under his heavy uniform. The bearskin hat felt like it weighed a ton, and his feet were already beginning to ache in the rigid boots. Yet he remained perfectly still, a living monument to tradition and discipline. Among the new arrivals was a group of college students from Italy, their energy infectious as they joked and laughed while taking selfies. One of them, a young woman with curly hair and bright eyes, seemed particularly intrigued by the guards. "I wonder what they think about while they stand there," she mused to her friends in accented English. It must be so boring just standing still all day. Her friend, a tall young man with a backpack covered in travel patches, grinned mischievously. Maybe they daydream about being rock stars or something. I bet underneath all that fancy uniform they're just regular people with regular dreams. The comment hit Thomas harder than expected. Regular dreams, was that what his musical ambitions were? Just regular dreams that he had been foolish to think could become reality? The weight of his suppressed creativity felt heavier than his uniform, heavier than the expectations placed upon him. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself listening more intently to the sounds around him. The chatter of tourists, the distant music from street performers, even the rhythmic footsteps of his fellow guards during their patrol routes. Everything seemed to form a symphony that only he could hear. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the ancient castle walls. Soon his shift would end, and he would return to his small apartment where his guitar waited in its case like an old friend he had forgotten to call. For the first time in months, Thomas felt a stirring of something that had been dormant, hope. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring visitors who would change everything. Tomorrow, a simple dare would unlock the voice he had kept hidden, and the entire world would finally hear the song that had been building inside him for years. Wednesday morning arrived with an unexpected drizzle that made the ancient stones of Windsor Castle glisten under the gray sky. Thomas Mitchell woke earlier than usual, his dreams filled with melodies that seemed to echo from somewhere deep in his memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different, though he had no idea why. As he prepared his uniform with the same meticulous care he had practiced for 3 years, Thomas caught himself humming. The tune was something he had written years ago, back when he still believed music could be his future. The melody felt foreign on his lips now, like speaking a language he had almost forgotten. His reflection in the mirror showed a man caught between two worlds, the disciplined soldier with perfect posture and pressed red tunic, and the dreamer whose eyes still held traces of the music he had abandoned. Thomas straightened his shoulders and pushed the conflicting thoughts away. Duty came first, just as his father had taught him. The walk to his post was different that morning, where he usually noticed the tourists gathering, the preparations for the changing of the guard and the security details. Today, he found himself listening to the city waking up. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. A street musician was already setting up near the entrance, tuning his acoustic guitar with practiced fingers. Thomas felt an unexpected pang of longing watching the musician. The man was probably in his 50s, weathered hands moving across the strings with the confidence that came from decades of practice. His guitar case was open, already containing a few coins from early morning commuters. Here was someone who had chosen music over security, art over stability. At his post, Thomas assumed his position with the same precision his training demanded. The tourists were fewer due to the weather, but those who had come seemed more determined, their umbrellas creating a colorful canopy around the castle grounds. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the fresh scent of wet stone and the gentle sound of water dripping from ancient gutters. Among the early visitors was a family from Australia. Parents with 3 children ranging from about 6 to 16 years old. The youngest, a girl with pigtails and a bright yellow raincoat, seemed fascinated by the guards. She stood directly in front of Thomas, studying his face with the intense curiosity that only children possess. "Daddy, why don't they ever smile?" she asked in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Her father, a man with kind eyes and work-worn hands, knelt beside her. "They're working, sweetheart. It's their job to be serious and protect the Queen. But everyone should smile sometimes," the little girl insisted. "Maybe they just need someone to tell them a joke." The middle child, a boy of about 10, had inherited his sister's boldness. "Or maybe they need to hear some music. Music makes everyone feel better." Their teenage sister rolled her eyes in the way only teenagers can. "You can't just make them sing, dummy. They're not allowed to do anything." "Says who?" the boy shot back, his voice carrying the challenge of someone too young to understand impossibility. Thomas felt something stirring inside him as he listened to their innocent debate. The children saw possibilities where adults saw only rules. They believed in the power of music to transform even the most rigid situations. Their simple faith in the magic of song reminded him of his younger self, before practical considerations had dampened his dreams. The family moved on, but their words lingered in Thomas's mind. Throughout the morning, he found himself thinking about their conversation. What would happen if he did sing? Would the sky fall? Would his career end? Or would people simply be surprised to discover that beneath the uniform was a human being with his own story to tell? Lunchtime brought a brief respite, and Thomas found himself walking past the street musician he had noticed that morning. The older man was playing a gentle folk song, his voice rough but genuine as he sang about traveling roads and finding home in music. A small crowd had gathered, and people were genuinely moved by the simple, honest performance. During his break, Thomas approached the musician. Up close, he could see the man's face was weathered by years of outdoor performances, but his eyes sparkled with the joy that comes from doing what you love. "Excuse me," Thomas said quietly, glancing around to make sure no superior officers were nearby. "I couldn't help but notice you're playing." "It's beautiful." The musician looked up, surprised to be addressed by one of the famous guards. "Thank you, son. Not often I get compliments from royalty," he said with a good-natured grin. Thomas felt himself blush. "Oh, I'm not royalty. Just a guard. But I used to play a bit myself." "Used to?" The older man's eyebrows rose. "What happened to it?" "Life, I suppose. Practical considerations. My father always said music was fine as a hobby, but not as a career." The musician nodded knowingly. "Ah, the old practical versus passionate debate. I've heard it 1,000 times. Can I tell you something, son? I tried the practical route once. Spent 15 years selling insurance. Made good money. Had a nice house, all the things people said I should want. But every day I felt like I was dying a little inside." Thomas found himself leaning closer, drawn in by the man's quiet intensity. "One day, I realized I was 50 years old and had never given my real dreams a proper chance. So I bought this guitar, left the insurance company, and started playing on street corners. Best decision I ever made. I may not have much money, but I wake up every morning excited about what the day might bring." The words hit Thomas like a revelation. Here was living proof that it wasn't too late to change course, that practical and passionate didn't have to be mutually exclusive. "What would you say to someone who's afraid to take that leap?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The musician smiled warmly. "I'd say fear is just excitement wearing a disguise. And I'd tell them that the world needs their music, whatever form it takes. You can't give people something you don't have, and if you've buried your passion so deep you can't find it anymore, how can you give your best to anything?" As Thomas walked back to his post, the musician's words echoed in his mind. The afternoon crowd was beginning to gather, and he could see tour groups forming up near the entrance. Among them was a group that would soon change his life forever. A collection of university students on a cultural exchange program, full of energy and curiosity about British traditions. They had heard about the stoic Queen's Guards and were eager to test the famous claim that nothing could make them break character. Little did they know that beneath Thomas's red tunic beat the heart of a musician who was finally ready to rediscover his voice. The stage was set for an encounter that would transform not just Thomas's day, but his entire understanding of who he could be. The seeds of change had been planted by a street musician's wisdom and a child's innocent question about the power of music. Tomorrow's headlines would speak of a viral video and an overnight sensation. But the real story was happening right now. In the quiet moments when a man realizes that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. The afternoon sun had finally broken through the morning clouds, casting warm golden light across the Windsor Castle courtyard. Thomas Mitchell stood at his post, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The conversation with the street musician had awakened something that had been dormant for too long, the belief that it might not be too late to reconnect with the music that had once defined his dreams. The crowd was larger now, typical for a Wednesday afternoon when tour groups descended upon the castle in waves. Thomas could see them forming up near the main entrance, families with children, elderly couples with guidebooks, and groups of young people with backpacks and cameras. Among them was a particularly energetic cluster of university students, who seemed more animated than the usual tourists. These were students from various European universities participating in a cultural exchange program. They had spent the morning at the British Museum and were now eager to experience the famous tradition of the Queen's Guard. Their guide, a cheerful woman in her 40s, was explaining the history and protocols as they approached Thomas's section of the courtyard. "Now remember," she was saying in accented English, "these guards are highly trained soldiers. They take their duty very seriously and will not respond to attempts to distract them. It's considered disrespectful to try to make them break character. Among the students was Sophia, a music major from Barcelona with dark hair and an infectious laugh. She had been studying British culture as part of her degree and was particularly fascinated by the traditions surrounding the monarchy. Beside her stood Eric, a tall student from Sweden, who was studying psychology and had been theorizing all morning about the mental discipline required to stand motionless for hours. I still don't believe they're completely emotionless, Eric said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. They're human beings. Somewhere inside they must react to things even if they don't show it. Maybe, Sophia replied. But look at them. They're like statues. I wonder if they even notice the music when street performers play nearby. A third student, Marco from Italy, grinned mischievously. You know what? I bet underneath all that serious exterior at least one of them has a secret talent. Maybe they write poetry or paint or sing, Sophia finished excitedly. Wouldn't that be amazing? Imagine if one of these serious guards had the voice of an angel. The conversation was taking place close enough to Thomas's post that he could hear every word. Despite his training to ignore distractions, he found himself intrigued by their speculation. These young people saw possibilities where others saw only rigid tradition. As the afternoon wore on, the group of students lingered longer than most tourists. They seemed genuinely curious about the guards as individuals rather than just photographic subjects. Thomas could feel their eyes on him, studying his face for any sign of humanity beneath the ceremonial stoicism. I have an idea, Marco announced suddenly, his voice carrying the bold confidence of youth. What if we tried something different? Not trying to make them laugh or move, but something more. Artistic? Sophia raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Well, you're a music student, right? What if you tried singing something, just to see if there's any reaction? Not to be disrespectful, but to see if there's a person underneath the uniform who appreciates music. Eric nodded thoughtfully. It's actually a fascinating psychological experiment. Music is one of the most powerful emotional triggers humans have. If anything could provoke a response, Thomas felt his heart rate increase slightly. The idea both thrilled and terrified him. Part of him wanted to hear Sophia sing, to experience music in this formal, rigid environment where it was so notably absent. Another part of him feared what his reaction might reveal about the depth of longing he had been suppressing. Sophia seemed to consider the idea seriously. I don't know. The guide said it was disrespectful to try to distract them. But music isn't really a distraction, is it? Marco argued. It's more like offering beauty, like giving a gift. The conversation was drawing attention from other tourists who began gathering around the students with interest. Soon a small crowd had formed, creating an impromptu audience for whatever was about to unfold. Thomas could feel the anticipation building around him. His training demanded that he remain impassive no matter what happened, but the musician in him, the part of himself he had tried to bury, was stirring with unprecedented intensity. What would you sing? Asked a middle-aged American tourist who had been listening to the students' debate. Sophia smiled shyly. I don't know. Maybe something classical, something beautiful that anyone could appreciate, regardless of language barriers. How about Ave Maria? Suggested an elderly British woman with a kind face. It's beautiful and universal. If anything could reach a person's soul, that would be it. The crowd was growing larger and word was spreading among the other tourists that something interesting might be about to happen. Cameras were being readied, though not in the usual tourist photographing guard way. There was a sense that whatever was about to occur might be genuinely special. Thomas could feel sweat forming under his bearskin hat, and not just from the afternoon sun. The anticipation was building to an almost unbearable level. Every instinct told him to remain perfectly still, to ignore whatever was about to happen. But another voice, one that sounded remarkably like the street musician from that morning, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he had been unconsciously waiting for. Sophia finally stepped forward, her decision made. Okay, she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. But I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I just want to share something beautiful. She positioned herself about 10 feet in front of Thomas, close enough that he could see the genuine kindness in her eyes. The crowd fell silent, creating a natural amphitheater around the scene that was about to unfold. Thomas's heart was pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. The moment felt suspended in time. The afternoon sun, the ancient stones of the castle, the expectant crowd, and most importantly, the young woman preparing to sing in honor of something she believed existed beneath his rigid exterior. Sophia took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to sing. Her voice rose clear and pure in the afternoon air, the opening notes of Ave Maria floating across the courtyard with ethereal beauty. The crowd fell completely silent, captivated by the unexpected concert happening before them. Even the other guards seemed to still further, as if the music had cast a spell over the entire scene. But something extraordinary was happening inside Thomas. The music wasn't just reaching his ears, it was awakening every suppressed melody he had ever written, every song he had dreamed of sharing, every note of passion he had buried beneath years of disciplined silence. For the first time in 3 years, the musician in him was fully alive, and then without conscious decision, without thought for consequences or regulations or career implications, Thomas Mitchell began to feel his lips parting. The harmony that would complement Sophia's beautiful melody was building in his chest, demanding to be released. The dare hadn't been spoken yet, but the music itself was calling to him, challenging him to remember who he had been before he became a statue. The moment of truth was arriving faster than he had ever imagined possible. Sophia's voice soared through the courtyard, each note of Ave Maria more beautiful than the last. The crowd stood mesmerized, their cameras forgotten as they witnessed something far more captivating than they had expected. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle seemed to amplify her voice, creating a natural concert hall that transformed the formal space into something magical. Thomas felt every fiber of his being responding to the music. His carefully maintained composure was cracking like ice in spring sunshine. The harmony that complemented Sophia's melody was building inside his chest with such intensity that he could barely contain it. His breathing had become deeper, more rhythmic, unconsciously matching the tempo of her song. As Sophia reached the most soaring passage of the piece, something unexpected happened. Marco, emboldened by the beauty of the moment and the growing excitement of the crowd, called out in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "If you can hear the music, if it moves you at all, show us. Sing with her." The dare hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a knight. The crowd held its collective breath, suddenly understanding that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. Cameras that had been lowered in respect for Sophia's performance were now being raised again, fingers hovering over record buttons. Thomas felt the moment crystallize around him. Every choice he had ever made, every dream he had abandoned, every compromise he had accepted led to this single instant. The discipline that had kept him statue still for 3 years warred with the music that had defined his soul, long before he ever put on the red tunic. Sophia, sensing something shifting in the atmosphere, opened her eyes and looked directly at Thomas. What she saw there made her own voice falter slightly, not from uncertainty but from recognition. Behind the perfectly controlled exterior, she glimpsed the soul of someone who understood music as deeply as she did. The crowd was completely silent now, except for Sophia's continuing melody. Even the other guards seemed to have frozen in a different way, as if they too sensed that something monumental was about to happen. Thomas could see tourists holding their breath, children wide-eyed with anticipation, elderly visitors leaning forward as if witnessing history in the making. And then, as Sophia began the final, most beautiful passage of Ave Maria, something inside Thomas finally broke free. It started as barely a whisper, so quiet that only Sophia could hear it. A rich, resonant baritone harmony that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than his throat, from his very soul. The sound was tentative at first, as if testing whether such beauty was still possible after years of enforced silence. But as the harmony found its place alongside Sophia's soprano, Thomas's voice grew stronger. The years of suppressed music poured out of him like water breaking through a dam. His voice was classically trained, something the crowd couldn't know, the result of years of choir practice and private lessons that his parents had considered character building, but never a real career option. The effect on the crowd was electric. Gasps of amazement rippled through the gathering as they realized they were witnessing the impossible. A Queen's Guard not just singing, but singing with professional quality skill and obvious passion. Phones were immediately raised, fingers frantically trying to capture this once-in-a-lifetime moment. Thomas's harmony wove around Sophia's melody with the practiced ease of someone who had spent countless hours studying musical composition. His voice was rich and powerful, trained but full of raw emotion that no amount of technical skill could replicate. The combination of their voices created something transcendent, a duet that transformed the formal castle courtyard into a sacred space. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she heard the depth of musicality in Thomas's voice. This wasn't just someone with a pleasant singing voice. This was a true musician, someone who understood the emotional architecture of the piece they were sharing. Her own performance lifted to new heights, inspired by the unexpected partnership. The crowd was growing by the minute as word spread through the castle grounds. Visitors came running from other areas, guided by the sound of something extraordinary happening. Even castle staff and security personnel found themselves drawn to the scene, their professional duties momentarily forgotten in the face of such unexpected beauty. Thomas was fully committed now, his training as a guard temporarily set aside as he remembered what it felt like to be truly alive through music. His voice soared alongside Sophia's, creating harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with emotion. The rigid posture remained. He was still technically at his post, but his face had transformed completely. The stoic mask had fallen away, replaced by the expression of someone experiencing pure joy. As they approached the climax of the piece, other voices began to join in. A man in the crowd who recognized the piece added his tenor to the mix. An elderly woman who had sung in church choirs for decades contributed her aged but still beautiful alto. What had begun as a dare was becoming a spontaneous choir, with Thomas and Sophia as the unlikely leaders. The scene was being captured on dozens of phones and cameras. Videos were already being uploaded to social media platforms, tagged with phrases like "Royal Guard singing, amazing voice, and you won't believe this." The internet's ability to make moments viral was beginning to work its magic, but none of the participants were thinking about fame or followers. They were lost in the pure magic of shared music. Castle security was approaching. Drawn by the crowd and the obvious deviation from protocol, Thomas could see them in his peripheral vision, but for once in his 3 years of service, he didn't care about regulations or consequences. This moment was too precious, too real, too much like coming home after a long journey to abandon for the sake of rules. As the final notes of Ave Maria echoed off the ancient stones, the silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that follows truly transcendent art, not empty, but full of awe and the recognition that everyone present had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Sophia and Thomas looked at each other across the 10 feet that separated them, and in that look was the acknowledgement of two musicians who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. The crowd around them was beginning to realize that they held in their hands video evidence of something that would soon captivate the world. The applause, when it finally came, was thunderous. But Thomas barely heard it. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like himself again, not just a guard in a uniform, but a human being with music in his soul and the courage to share it with the world. What happened next would change everything, but in that moment of perfect clarity following the music, Thomas Mitchell knew without a doubt that he had made the right choice. The musician he had buried was not only still alive but stronger than ever, ready to embrace whatever came next. The applause seemed to go on forever, washing over Thomas in waves that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. He stood there still in his perfect guard position, but everything had changed. The crowd was cheering not just for the music, but for the humanity they had witnessed breaking through the ceremonial facade. Children were clapping excitedly, adults were wiping tears from their eyes, and teenagers were frantically sharing videos that were already beginning to spread across social media platforms. Sophia approached him slowly, her own eyes bright with tears of joy and amazement. "That was incredible," she said softly, her voice still carrying traces of the emotion from their duet. "You have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. Where did you train?" Thomas found himself in uncharted territory. For 3 years he had maintained perfect silence while on duty, but the music had broken more than just his voice free. It had awakened his ability to connect with another human being in a way that transcended protocol and regulation. "Manchester, Conservatory," he replied quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "A lifetime ago." The crowd was pressing closer, everyone wanting to be part of whatever magic had just occurred. Phones were being thrust forward, people were calling out questions and compliments, and the energy was building to a crescendo that felt both wonderful and overwhelming. That's when the castle security team arrived. Sergeant Williams, Thomas's direct superior, pushed through the crowd with a mixture of concern and bewilderment on his face. He had heard about the disruption but hadn't believed the reports until he saw the scene for himself. Hundreds of tourists surrounding one of his guards, cameras recording everything, and Thomas himself looking more alive than Williams had ever seen him. "Mitchell," Sergeant Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of military command, "step away from your post now." The crowd's energy shifted instantly. The celebration turned to concern as people realized that Thomas might be in serious trouble for his beautiful act of humanity. Sophia stepped protectively closer as if she could somehow shield him from the consequences of the moment they had shared. "Please," Sophia said to Sergeant Williams, "he didn't do anything wrong. He was just sharing something beautiful. The music was a gift." Sergeant Williams looked around at the crowd, at the phone still recording, at the obvious affection and support the tourists were showing for Thomas. This was a situation unlike anything covered in his training manual. He had a soldier who had clearly broken protocol, but he also had hundreds of witnesses who had just experienced something that appeared to be genuinely special. "Sir," Thomas said, finding his voice and addressing his superior with the respect his training demanded, "I take full responsibility for my actions. The crowd didn't pressure me. The choice was mine." As Thomas spoke, something remarkable began to happen. The crowd, sensing that he was in trouble, started to speak up on his behalf. Voices from all directions began sharing what the moment had meant to them. "He brought tears to my eyes," called out an elderly gentleman with a cane. "In 60 years of visiting this castle, I've never experienced anything so moving." "My daughter has been afraid of the guards," added a young mother, holding a small girl who was now smiling shyly at Thomas. "But now she sees they're real people with beautiful gifts to share. This is what makes Britain special," declared a tourist with an unmistakable Australian accent. "Not just the ceremony and tradition, but the humanity underneath it all." The voices multiplied, creating a chorus of support that surprised everyone, including Thomas himself. These were people from all over the world, from different cultures and backgrounds, united in their recognition that they had witnessed something authentically beautiful. Sergeant Williams found himself in an impossible position. Military discipline demanded that he reprimand Thomas for breaking protocol, but the evidence before his eyes suggested that what had happened was not a disruption of duty, but perhaps its highest fulfillment, bringing joy and connection to people from around the world who had come to appreciate British culture and tradition. The crowd continued to voice their support. Something else was happening that none of them yet realized. The videos of Thomas singing were already going viral online. Within minutes of being uploaded, they were being shared across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. The hashtags Your Singing Guard, Royal Voice, and Windsor Magic were beginning to trend globally. News outlets were picking up the story with remarkable speed. The BBC received its first call about something extraordinary happening at Windsor Castle just 10 minutes after Thomas had finished singing. International media organizations were already dispatching crews, recognizing the kind of heartwarming story that captures global attention. Meanwhile, back in the courtyard, Sergeant Williams made a decision that would prove to be as wise as it was unprecedented. Looking at Thomas, then at the crowd, then at the obvious positive impact of what had just occurred, he stepped closer to his subordinate. "Mitchell," he said in a voice loud enough for the crowd to hear, "that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in 20 years of service. But we need to talk about what happens next." The crowd cheered at this response, interpreting it correctly as a sign that Thomas wasn't going to be severely punished for his moment of musical expression. Sophia clasped her hands together in relief, and Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Sir," Thomas replied, "whatever the consequences, it was worth it. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again." Sergeant Williams nodded slowly. He was a career military man, but he was also human, and what he had witnessed had moved him more than he cared to admit. "Son, I think we're going to need to have a very different kind of conversation than either of us expected when we woke up this morning." As castle officials arrived to manage the growing crowd and media attention, Thomas caught Sophia's eye one more time. In her expression, he saw recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood that music wasn't just a hobby or a career choice, but a fundamental part of who they were as human beings. "Thank you," he said to her simply. "Thank you," she replied. "You've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. It's not about performance or perfection, it's about connection." Neither of them knew it yet, but their impromptu duet was about to change both of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The crowd was slowly beginning to disperse as castle officials worked to restore normal operations, but the energy of what had happened lingered in the air like the echo of a perfect note. Thomas could see other guards at their posts looking in his direction with expressions ranging from amazement to concern. He had broken the most fundamental rule of their service, yet somehow it felt like the most right thing he had ever done. As Sergeant Williams escorted him away from his post for what would undoubtedly be a lengthy discussion about protocol and consequences, Thomas turned back one last time to look at the place where his life had changed forever. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed centuries of history, but today they had been part of something entirely new, a moment when tradition and authentic human expression had come together to create something beautiful. The tourists were still talking excitedly among themselves, sharing the videos they had captured and marveling at what they had experienced. Many were already planning to tell this story for years to come. The day they witnessed a Queen's Guard remember that he was human first, soldier second, Sophia watched Thomas being led away, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected gift he had given her. She had come to Windsor Castle as a tourist, but she was leaving as someone who had participated in a moment of pure musical magic. The memory of their voices joining together would inspire her own music for years to come. As Thomas disappeared into the castle's administrative offices, the full weight of what had just occurred was beginning to settle over everyone involved. The videos were spreading faster than anyone could track, and the world was about to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when someone has the courage to let their authentic self break free from the constraints that society places upon us. The dare had been answered, the voice had been heard, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The meeting with castle officials lasted 3 hours, but Thomas Mitchell emerged from those administrative offices as a completely different man than the one who had entered. What should have been a disciplinary hearing had transformed into something unprecedented, a discussion about how to handle a situation that no protocol manual had ever anticipated. The videos of his duet with Sophia had exploded across social media with a speed that astounded everyone involved. Within 6 hours, the hashtag #TheSingingGuard had been viewed over 10 million times. News organizations from around the world were requesting interviews. The story had captured something that people desperately needed, a reminder that beneath all the formal structures and rigid traditions that govern our lives, human creativity and connection could still break through. Colonel Harrison, the castle's commanding officer, had made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Rather than punishing Thomas for breaking protocol, he had recognized that what occurred represented the best possible outcome of the Guard's mission: to honor British tradition while inspiring people from around the world to see the humanity and excellence that the institution represented. Mitchell, Colonel Harrison had said during their meeting, "In 30 years of service, I've never seen anything that better embodied the spirit of what we're trying to achieve here. You've reminded people that our traditions are maintained by real human beings with extraordinary talents and deep character." The phone calls had started almost immediately. Record labels, talent agents, television producers, and concert promoters were all reaching out through official channels, trying to connect with the singing guard who had captivated the world. But Thomas wasn't thinking about fame or fortune as he walked back to his quarters that evening. He was thinking about the feeling of his voice joining with Sophia's, the moment when music had made everything else fade away. His phone had dozens of missed calls and hundreds of messages. Friends from Manchester who had seen the videos online were reaching out in amazement. His parents had left voicemails that ranged from concern about his military career to pride in seeing their son's musical gifts finally recognized. His old music teacher from the conservatory had sent a message that simply read, "I always knew this day would come. Call me." But the message that meant the most was from Sophia. She had managed to get his contact information through the cultural exchange program, and her text was simple but profound. Thank you for reminding me that music is about courage as much as skill. I hope this is just the beginning for you." Over the following days, the story continued to grow. The BBC ran a feature story about Thomas's background, revealing his training at Manchester Conservatory and the dreams he had set aside for military service. International news programs picked up the story as an example of unexpected beauty breaking through in the most unlikely circumstances. The most surprising development came a week later, when Thomas received an official invitation that would change everything. The Royal Albert Hall, one of the most prestigious concert venues in the world, had extended an invitation for him to perform in a special concert celebrating the voice of tradition. The event would feature classical musicians from various military services around the world, but Thomas would be the headline performer. The invitation included a personal note from the venue's director. "Your moment at Windsor Castle reminded us that the greatest art often emerges when authentic expression meets the courage to share it. We would be honored to provide a stage worthy of the voice that has already moved the world." Thomas stared at the invitation for a long time, remembering the street musician's words about fear being excitement in disguise. The opportunity was everything he had dreamed of as a young man at the conservatory, but it was also terrifying in its magnitude. The decision came to him not as a moment of grand revelation, but as a quiet recognition of something that had always been true. Music wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. The 3 years of silence hadn't killed that part of him. They had only made it stronger, more refined, more precious. 2 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall, wearing a specially designed uniform that honored both his military service and his role as a performer. The audience included everyone from members of the royal family to street musicians, from conservatory students to tourists who had traveled from around the world to hear the voice that had first captivated them in a castle courtyard. Sophia was in the front row, having flown in from Barcelona specifically for the concert. Their friendship had grown through phone calls and messages, built on their shared understanding of music's power to transform lives and connect people across all boundaries. As Thomas stepped up to the microphone, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The years of suppressed dreams, the morning conversation with a street musician, the dare from brave young tourists, and most importantly, the moment when he had chosen courage over comfort, authenticity over safety. He began to sing the same piece that had started it all, Ave Maria, but this time his voice filled one of the world's greatest concert halls. The acoustics carried every note to perfection, but the real magic was the same as it had been in the castle courtyard, a human being sharing their deepest truth through music. The standing ovation lasted for 15 minutes. But for Thomas, the greatest reward was seeing the faces in the audience. People of all ages and backgrounds united in their recognition of something beautiful and real. In the front row, Sophia was crying tears of joy, remembering the moment when a simple dare had unleashed something extraordinary. After the concert, as Thomas greeted well-wishers and signed autographs, he was approached by a young boy who looked remarkably similar to the child who had asked about singing guards all those months ago. "Mr. Guard," the boy said shyly, "my teacher says you teach us that we should never stop believing in our dreams, even when they seem impossible." Thomas knelt down to the boy's level, remembering his own childhood dreams and the long journey that had brought him to this moment. "What's your dream?" he asked. "I want to be a musician," the boy replied. "But my dad says it's not practical." Thomas smiled, thinking of all the practical advice he had received over the years, and how close he had come to letting it silence him forever. "Can I tell you a secret?" he said. "The most practical thing you can ever do is become exactly who you're meant to be. Everything else is just details." As the boy ran back to his family, eyes bright with renewed hope, Thomas realized that this was what the whole journey had been about. Not fame or recognition, but the simple act of giving others permission to believe in the possibility of their own dreams. The man who had once stood silent in a red tunic, suppressing every note of who he really was, had become someone who helped others find their voice. The dare had been answered, the voice had been heard, and the song continued to ripple outward, inspiring others to find the courage to let their own authentic selves break free. Standing in the Royal Albert Hall, surrounded by the echoes of applause and the warmth of human connection, Thomas Mitchell knew that sometimes the most extraordinary life begins the moment you decide to stop hiding who you really are. The music had always been there, waiting patiently for him to remember that some things are too important to sacrifice, no matter how practical the world insists on being. The story that had begun with a simple dare had become a symphony of possibility, proving that it's never too late to find your voice and share it with a world that desperately needs to hear it.